Welcome to the Great Big Book Club. And I'm really delighted to interview Liz, who is E.C Fremantle here. And congratulations on your 6th novel, I think it is, isn't it?
Yes.
Yeah, The Honey and the Sting, which is hugely addictive. And it's an amazing title. I found the title so memorable and sexy and quite worrying, that title.
Well, actually, it's a quote. It's a contemporary quote from Francis Bacon, the philosopher, not the painter. And I found it it's a piece of advice given to the Duke of Buckingham about his advice on style of getting people to do what you want. And I thought I've got to use it as a title.
It's the perfect title. It's an amazing title. It really is, and it looks beautiful as well. Have you got a copy of the book?
I have got a copy.
Because I think you should show us. Yeah.
It looks back. It's backwards, back to front in the Zoom, but there it is anyway.
But there's the lovely cover and the fantastic title. Shall I quickly outline the plot, or do you want to do that?
Oh, I don't know. No, I mean, I'd love to hear what your outline of the plot, because
I've just got the shortest little outline. So why don't I do that, and then you, and then I'd love to know what you think of it thematically. I mean, I've certainly got lots of ideas. But so the setting of The Honey and the Sting is 1628, and it's a story of 3 sisters, and one of them has a child by rape by George Villiers, who's the Duke of Buckingham, and a favourite or debatably lover of James I. He wants to claim the son, which puts the 3 sisters in danger, and so they flee, but Villiers gets his sidekick Felton to pursue them, and it's a real cat and mouse game that follows. They have secret knowledge about Villiers that could undo them or undo him or save them. It becomes then very twisted and very plotty and very exciting, and I don't want to give away more than that. But I just wondered, what gave you the idea in the first place to write? Was it wanting to write about the women or the 2 real-life historical characters who are Villiers and Felton?
Yes, that's a good question. I mean, this is not really the book I set out to write, and that's never happened to me before, that I've written something that's actually quite different. I had wanted to write a companion piece to my previous novel, which is The Poison Bed, which was set around the circumstances of a real Jacobean murder that happened in the court, James I's court, that was a huge scandal, and it involved James I's the lover he had prior to Villiers, or Buckingham, as you know, he became known as. I believe they were lovers. Some historians will say, well, there's no proof, but we don't really have proof about what goes on behind the doors of the great bedchamber. But and so this is set around the circumstances of another really very famous murder that happened, that involved another lover of James I. And so they in a sense, I wanted to write 2 books that went as a pair. And but I had wanted to write the story of a woman, a real historical figure called Frances Cook, who was Villiers' sister-in-law. She'd been forcibly married to Villiers' completely mad, needed to be locked away mad brother, because she was an heiress, really an heiress in her own right, and one of the potentially wealthiest women in the country, and she also had a title that came with her wealth. And the Villiers family basically wanted to grasp all that for themselves. And I wanted to tell her story, and she had a child and went into hiding because the Duke was trying to have her put away for adultery. But I couldn't make that story work. It's never happened to me before that my real historical figure I cannot shoehorn the story into my fictional scheme, because really there were various themes that I wanted to cover, and it just didn't really work. So I invented my three sisters, and somehow each of them managed to carry one of my themes. So
that's really interesting, because when you're talking about shoehorning it in, do you always think thematically rather than that there's a plot and then the historical character fits in or not? I mean, do you start thematically?
Yes, I always start with themes. And with these two novels, I mean, the themes were kind of ideas that came out of Jacobean revenge tragedy. And really one of the strong themes of this novel is revenge. And I wanted that idea of the woman as the agent of moral collapse that comes out of Jacobean tragedy. And I wanted to explore that, twist it, put a kind of contemporary spin on it, which, you know, I hope I've achieved in both of them and in very different ways in each of the novels. So yes, it always starts with an idea, but it also always starts with an idea that rises out of the story of somebody or a historical event. So usually the story of the person and the ideas, as I write, they start to chime together. But I couldn't make that happen with this until I really made it much, much more of a fictional story.
And was that very frustrating if that's unprecedented? Did you ever think about giving it up, or did you just really make yourself think of different ways in which to tell this story?
I nearly gave up on it. I mean, I possibly would have given up on it had it not been a novel that was under contract with a deadline. And I don't know, I must have a fairly sort of tenacious element to my character, because somehow I couldn't quite give up on it, and I thought, I've got to make it work. But it did mean really going back to the beginning and rewriting it several times from scratch, so that really what's left in this final draft is there's only about 5% of the original draft in it. So I mean, it's as if I've written 3 novels and arrived at one. I hated it for a while and wanted to give it up, but I made it work in the end, I hope. Yeah.
Well, I think you did make it work in the end, and I would never guess any of that. But what you describe is a horribly, horribly common experience for writers at some novel in their career. You know, if you're on the 6th, I'm not surprised that this happens at a certain point, and the ending up with 5% of what you start with is really horribly common, and readers don't understand that, and I'm glad that they don't. But you know, it does take a lot of work, doesn't it? You find you just have to work incredibly hard at these things.
And I think the thing one always thinks is that the more you do something, the better you get at it and the easier it becomes. But that's just simply not been my experience. My experience has been that I think I set my own bar higher and higher, and then I find it increasingly difficult to achieve what I'm trying to set out to do. And yeah, but I mean, you know, I despite all that, I do enjoy it, and I really, you know, although it was frustrating and difficult, I've enjoyed the writing process, more or less.
So you're in a position now where this is published on August the 6th, isn't it, in the UK? You'll also be published in the US, and you're published in many languages. So you know, it's going really well. you're in a fine position now. Can we go back to the beginning of when did you start wanting to write and what happened?
Okay, well, I didn't have, I mean, I think every novelist has a kind of, you know, a story where they, you know, it took them ages and ages to get published, and that's my story too. I had always wanted to write fiction, probably because it was my place of shelter as a child. You know, it was the place I escaped to, was reading books, and I'd read favourite books over and over and over again. And but then I kind of messed things up a bit, and I didn't properly finish my education, and I didn't do A-levels, I didn't go to university, and I had to do all that much later. I went to university when my children were little, and then went on and did an MA in creative writing, because I thought, you know, if I'm going to write, I need to have the proper education. I think I always had a chip on my shoulder about not having finished my education. And then I had all these degrees, and that had all gone really well, but it then took me another 10 years and 3 unpublished novels before my first published novel happened. And that was a historical novel about Catherine Parr, as Elizabeth Fremantle rather than E.C Fremantle. It was a more straightforward, I'd call it not biography, but in a sense a biographical fiction of Catherine Parr. And I wrote 4 novels that had, you know, that were of that kind of tone. Yeah.
It's fascinating because it is a long process. I mean, I often say to my students that often it can take 10 years. That's kind of the number of years I think it, on average, maybe it takes from looking at it. But I mean, you must be really tenacious to have just carried on and done everything much later. And it's interesting, I think, because I think in some ways, if you come at it that way, maybe the material is more original and interesting rather than just following the usual route of A-levels and then an English degree. And then, as many people say, they're kind of intimidated by the canon, and it actually puts them off writing for a while. Whereas you did it the other way around, which I find interesting. In terms of writing earlier novels and then historical, how did that change happen?
Well, I think, I mean, when I studied English rather than history, but I studied a lot of early modern literature, and so that's Tudor Elizabethan, and I became very interested in, and Jacobean, and I became very interested not only in all those incredible plays and all those stories of that period that we all know so well, but some of the more fringe writing. There were many female voices emerging in that period, and there was an unprecedented 50 years of female rule. We had Jane Grey for, well, it wasn't 9 days, it was 14 days actually that she reigned. And then we had Mary Tudor, and then we had Elizabeth, who went on and on and on, right into the early 17th century. 50 years of women on the throne, that had never happened before. You know, the idea of a woman being on the throne was complete anathema to the Tudors, the people of that period. It was such a turning upside down of everything they understood was the right order of things. You know, men were on top, women came underneath, and, you know, animals below them. And so it was an interesting time in terms of gender politics. It didn't really change a huge amount, but female voices did start to emerge, and I became really interested in those female voices. And Catherine Parr was one of them. She was a best-selling author in her time and a political activist. Nobody really knows that, and that's why I really wanted to write about her, but I didn't really feel I had the right to write about history if I wasn't a historian. And it was my kind of lack of success at being able to write anything else that kind of forced me to reassess the possibility of doing that. And I had a very supportive agent who said, look, what the hell, just do it. People, you don't have to be a historian to write historical fiction. It's fiction. So in a way, having that permission kind of helped me kind of launch myself into it. And really that was how I found my voice initially. Yeah. And now, you know, I keep saying, oh, I think I'll write a contemporary novel, I think. And my editor's going, no, we want another historical novel from you. So yeah, maybe I'm stuck with it.
I'm fascinated that, you know, women were ruling for that long, but obviously incredibly oppressed. And you do seem to have a theme of writing about silenced or oppressed women finally finding their voices, or in this case, there's revenge enacted. Is that a theme that you think is running throughout your work?
Yeah. It's not hard to spot in my work. You know, it's always there, and I like to also look at it's the female voice, be it the voice of, I'm writing now about a Baroque painter, a female Baroque painter, and her work is as much her voice as other writers and poets that I've included in my novels. And actually, but these three sisters, they're ordinary women. They're not, I've often written about women who are kind of players at the kind of at court, the kind of fulcrum of power of the period. And so they have great influence in their own way. They can influence the men around them and influence the political situation. But these women, they're just ordinary women. And I hadn't set out to do that, I realized that was a really kind of important progress in my work, that how did the kind of the power decisions that were being made by men like Buckingham, who was a kind of almost Trumpian ruler in the way he did not have the intellectual capacity to match up to the power he'd been given, but how the decisions he was making filtered down into the ordinary lives of ordinary people, and particularly women. So in a sense, these women don't have a specific means to be heard, to speak out, but they, in their own personal way, I give them the means to enact, I give them agency, but it's kind of a fantasy, because women like them would never have arrived at a place where they had any agency. So in some ways, the novel is a fantasy novel. It's not just as a Gothic revenge thriller or mystery, it's a fantasy. And I surprised myself by writing that in some ways.
But what's interesting is that it seems quite plausible. It doesn't really read as a fantasy, even though you can kind of think it through and think, yes, could some of that happen? But actually the way you write it, you know, we do suspend disbelief and we are carried along by those stories. But what I'm also interested in is how you're inserting these various issues in quite a subtle way, but which are relevant to contemporary women's lives. I mean, you know, you're touching on race and really about what's mental health, you know, clairvoyancy, witchcraft, whatever, homosexuality, you know, patriarchy. And it's all of that is going on under what is really quite a fast-paced, relatively commercial novel. So I was just wondering how you do that without ever being didactic or obvious.
That's interesting. I'm not entirely sure. I mean, I had really set out to write something that was a good read. I hate the idea of sort of ramming my kind of, you know, my themes down people's throats. You know, I want it to be a really great story, but also to, you know, allow myself to explore those things. And you know, by having my three female figures, each one could represent some kind of aspect of oppression, whilst kind of hopefully living properly on the page, and us caring about them and being so. So I think the characters carry those themes, and that's how it becomes a sort of proper good read, rather than me kind of saying lecturing people. You know, I think that's something I never really want to do. Though, you know, it's tempting, you know, to kind of bang on about, you know, these silenced women, but it doesn't make for great reading. So I wanted, you know, each of my characters. So as you touched on the idea of race, and the youngest sister she's the granddaughter of a pearl diver from the east coast of Africa, who had come to as a salvage diver to Europe. And you know, there's the whole backstory. We don't really get the backstory within the novel, but there she is. So she's a woman. I'd read, there's a book that Miranda Kaufman wrote. I mean, it's a kind of labour of love. She's an academic who has researched meticulously all the records, the civic records from the Tudor and Elizabethan period, looking to prove in her book that England was, if not fall to the gunnels, there were many people of colour living in England and not enslaved. They were doing normal jobs of work. It wasn't uncommon. Whereas I think there is this idea that we have, which is kind of filtered through a kind of Victorian sensibility of England as a, you know, a race of white people who'd never seen a black person. And so I wanted to just include this character in my book, who is a quarter African, but she's just one of the sisters. There's nothing necessarily remarkable about her heritage. She is just simply another character in my book, and I wanted her to be there, but I didn't want her to just be a cipher, or you know, I wanted her to be a real. She's a 16-year-old woman with, hopefully, who comes over as a complex character who carries some of the themes of the book, and again the themes of madness carried by the middle sister Melis, who is I imagined her as someone with schizophrenia. She has voices and visions, and she believes she can see into the future. And actually there was a woman, a contemporary woman, Eleanor Davies, who was a prophetess, and she prophesied all sorts of things, including the assassination of the Duke of Buckingham. And so I wanted to have a character that echoed that. There were lots of these people, not always women, and I think the women were taken less seriously than the men. They were often kind of religious prophets who sort of saw themselves as speaking the, you know, the kind of the mouthpiece of God, and I didn't want to do that with Melis. I wanted her visions to be a little bit more obscure than that. Yeah, so I those were ways I found to convey my themes of women.
Yeah, I found that they were there, but very subtle, because actually what happens is it's so plotted and it's so tense that you do just get carried away with that. And I wanted to ask you about plotting like that, because there are so many obstacles and near misses. And I'm also interested that we alternate points of view, because we see through lots of different, well, several different characters' viewpoints, which can often, in a novel, I think, spill the tension, because often you want to be guessing what the other one is thinking. Whereas here, we can see everyone's evil tricks. There are all these machinations, and actually that works in a completely different way, which is, we think, oh no, you know, poor woman, little do you know what's going on underneath here. And yet, so it's a very different way of doing things from many novels in that way. And I was fascinated by that. And I was fascinated just by how many twists there are. I mean, these are real whirlpools. Is it difficult? Do you ever get confused? How do you do it? Do you write it all out? I mean, do you have a great chart? How do you actually achieve this level of incredibly intricate plotting?
Well, I think to start, I set out to write a thriller, and I think that plot is absolutely key, and sort of twists and turns, that is the character of the genre. And I do tend to like to write things from different narrative perspectives, and in this there are three. So there's the young girl Hope, who is she's a sort of innocent voice. There's there's Felton, who is the sort of menacing voice, and then there's the kind of main character, who's Hester, who is the mother who's protecting her child. And I felt that, I mean, initially I thought about writing Felton. Felton's the man who's sent to hunt them down, basically. And in a previous draft, I've had him as the reader doesn't know why he's there. But actually there was no tension in that. So I thought it would work better with the dramatic irony of the reader knowing why he's there, but the characters not knowing. So I think that's where I derived the tension. And I hope it works. I mean, it sounds like you found it fairly twisty, and it's not sort of twisty in that there are no what do they call them, unreliable narrators. Everybody kind of knows what's going on to an extent, because everybody only has a partial view of things, but there is not Trixie in that way, I don't think. It's just the things that happen to them that are surprising.
It's almost the opposite of Trixie in that it doesn't have that contemporary psychological thriller aspect of hiding things from the reader and actually, to some extent playing tricks on the reader. So that was what I was fascinated by, that it is spelled out, and we do know what's going on, but then it does up the danger. I was also interested that one of them is written in the first person and two of them in the third person.
Yeah.
So was that because she was essentially your protagonist?
Yes, I did. Yes, I did feel that somehow, sometimes voices just kind of insist upon being told in a specific way. And I had, in fact, written Hope and Hester, both in the first person. But somehow that didn't really work, and I did feel it gave Hester some prominence if she could be the eye of the novel. And the others, Felton had always, he was only ever going to be in the third person. And I felt also, in some ways, that because of Hester's position as a mixed race character, that in a sense, third person was the appropriate voice for her, because I didn't feel it was right to assume to see things through her eyes. Whereas Hester is the character who is, I mean, in a sense, she's not me, she's not like me, but there's the most, the character that's closest to me. So in a sense, I felt telling her through, the story through her eyes, it just felt right. I mean, sometimes, you have to go on feeling as a novelist. I mean, would you agree with that? Do you sometimes things just feel right in a certain way, and so yes, they just happened like that, but they did change a little bit on the road. I think I did do a draft with Hester in the third person. It just felt a bit distant, and I wanted people to kind of really see her thought processes in a way. I mean, you can do that with third person, but less so in some ways. Mm.
Yes, it's interesting. I think as a writer that you can try many different things and have all sorts of theories and editorial advice, but sometimes you just have to go with your gut instinct or return to that. Anyway, I'm also interested in influences because just as a reader, I can see, I think, aspects of Sarah Waters here and Tracy Chevalier. And I was also reminded of Maggie O'Farrell's latest Hamlet, particularly with the bees. It's interesting that bees seem to be around. And that bees are in the news a lot. You know, it seems to be, because this is an issue. There's a big issue with not enough bees in our world now.
Yeah.
But I was just interested in that, and there are some crossovers with Hamlet, and I just wondered who you would cite as your main influences.
Well, I greatly admire Maggie O'Farrell, and I loved Hamlet, and I was really struck by some of the similarities. I mean, particularly that juxtaposition between country and town, the sort of wildness of the country is almost like a Midsummer Night's Dream juxtaposition, where in the country strange things happen, and the bees. And it's funny, I was reading another novel, a very good thriller by Lucy Atkins called Magpie Lane, which is a brand new book, and I was thinking, my goodness, it's set in Oxford. A lot of my books set in Oxford. It also has bees. It also there are all these similar themes in it, and I think sometimes there is just a moment when certain themes rise to the surface. But I'd never have said I was influenced by Maggie O'Farrell because I've never read a historical novel of hers until Hamlet. But I am a huge fan of Sarah Waters, and yeah, I mean, I'm sure her influence creeps into my work all the time. Yeah, but I mean, I try not to be overly influenced by other writers of historical fiction. I try to read a lot of contemporary fiction or much older fiction, and that those plays, the Jacobean plays, certainly I kind of scour them for ideas. But yeah, I guess Sarah Waters would be the person I'd be most flattered to be compared to.
It's funny, Sarah Waters has trained me up now to not ignore the maid in the room, and indeed when I saw your one called Joan, I thought, she's going to have some role, isn't she?
Yeah. Yes.
I'm also interested that there are long passages of just the domestic and the rural, like you were saying with Hamlet. There's lots of quite idyllic, rustic scenes, and just where we're focusing on domestic life, and yet there is always something simmering there. We know that there's a darkness, we know that there's this undertow all the time. It never quite lets up, even in these very quite lovely domestic scenarios between the sisters, and there's always something there. Now, again, are you doing that consciously, or is that just that your plot so well that it's always there?
Well, I think in terms of that kind of the recreation of the kind of pre-industrial England. When you're writing historical fiction, it's really, really important to set the scene. But I never, I think, if it's not something fast-paced like this, you can really drop into, and actually Maggie O'Farrell does this in Hamlet, really drops into kind of wonderful lyrical pages and pages of kind of scene setting that's really, really beautiful, and she does it exquisitely. I have to kind of rein myself in a bit with that, because I wanted the pace to be fast. So it's about getting a balance. The reader you have to keep reminding the reader where you are with historical fiction. So that all the kind of processes of, I don't know, bread making, cheese making, the things that happen in the kitchen, the things that happen in the house, which is, those domestic, we need to be reminded that the domestic arena was the female space at the time. And, so I do keep going back to that. And as they are stuck in a house, I mean, in isolation, actually, rather ironically, they are stuck in this house, and the house is a kind of character in the book as well. The house seems to start behaving strangely, and some characters think that the house is haunted. And so it's sort of almost like the domestic arena is turning on the women. And so that is where I managed to kind of create a sense of menace. But there's always also the jeopardy, because we know what danger they're in. As the reader knows all the time what danger they're in. So you can read danger into everything. The bees seem dangerous, the knife that cuts, the bread seems dangerous. There's everything is sharp and potentially hazardous. That was deliberate. Yeah.
That's interesting. And then I think readers are really interested in the process. So I'm still not sure about how you're plotting like this. I mean, do you have a spreadsheet? Do you use a mood board? And I just wondered about your day in general, and as a writer, how about self-discipline and how you start, really. But I'm definitely interested as a writer in how you achieve this level of plotting.
Yeah. Okay, well, this novel was completely plotted out meticulously. And that was the first draft. So actually that plot went to the wind. And so, in fact, the plot that happened subsequently was the result of writing and rewriting. And then at one point, I think before I wrote the final draft, I couldn't make it right. And my editor kept saying, what's going on here? I haven't got a clue what's happening. And so I made an actual spreadsheet of the plot from what I had and from scenes that I realized I needed to put in. So it was a kind of late process, and that finally helped me get it right. But it did, because it's complicated to make something like that work, and it has to feel seamless. The reader can't see all that effort, or the reader can't see the spreadsheet behind it, because that kind of takes away all the magic. But yes, I had a color-coded, I can't believe I did this, a color-coded Excel spreadsheet with all the plot points and where we are in the dates and what was happening historically at the time, and things I was referring to, the season. Actually, mostly it happens during 1 month in August. So the season was quite easy, thank God. But yeah, so I had everything. There'd just been a rainstorm. It was going to be wet in that scene. I had it all on my spreadsheet, and I've never done that before. But I will probably do that again. I haven't done it for the novel I'm working on now, because. Well, I have done quite a meticulous outline. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, that makes sense, because I was sometimes thinking, how is she keeping all this in the air, and how is she not getting confused herself? I mean, as a reader, you don't get confused, but when you're creating something that interwoven and that fast and that complex in terms of plotting, I was thinking, I'd have to a whole table's worth of spreadsheet, I think, for something like this.
And to just carry everything around in my head mainly, and I think that's why when I'm writing, it's very hard for me to really focus on anything much else at all, because I'm afraid I'll lose something really important that is sort of, everything's kind of slotting itself in like a Rubik's Cube all the time in my head whilst I'm going through the process of writing. And it just somehow works for me. I think it all comes from character. I think once you establish your characters properly, then you know where you are. So that's how I, you know, as long as my characters are behaving in character, or if they're not behaving in character, there's a good enough reason for them to be not behaving in character, then I feel secure that the thing's going to make sense.
Okay, brilliant. So just finally, you said you were writing about a Baroque artist, and I'd like to know a little bit about that, but also whether you will be tempted to go back to writing contemporary themes, contemporary fiction.
I mean, I'd really like to write some contemporary things. I've got a lot of ideas of what I'd like to do, but yes, the book I'm working on at the moment, I'm really excited about, it's a book about Artemisia Gentileski, who was, I mean, a really, really well-known, very successful female Baroque painter, Roman painter. And there was supposed to be a huge exhibition of her work at the National Gallery, which was postponed because of COVID. But I've just heard it's going to open in October. So hopefully we won't be in the middle of a second wave, and everything will have to close down again by then. But it will be incredible to see so much of her work all in one place. So the book is not really a kind of biographical novel. It's much more a novel, again, of themes, and it's set around, she was raped by, it's called A Lesson in Perspective. She was raped by a man who was employed to teach her a lesson in perspective. And the story is, I mean, I hesitate to say the story is about her rape, because, you know, I think it's important that we don't see her entire life and her work and her brilliance as defined by that one event. But I think there's a single painting that's an incredibly brutal, violent painting that seems to have been a work that came out of that event. So the novel is about the painting, that event, and it's also about her father and her relationship with her father, who was also a painter, who taught her, but about him coming to terms with the extreme jealousy he felt because she was more talented than him. So yes, jealousy, violence, it's all there. But I'm in Rome, which is great. I've never been to Rome, and I couldn't go because we were in lockdown, and I'm now writing, so I've just got to write. But thank heavens for the internet and Google, whatever it's called, you know, where you can go look at streets, and Google Street Map, I think it is, isn't it? Yeah.
Google Earth?
Google Earth, yeah, and street maps, street something. Anyway.
Maybe as well.
Loads of them, and they're fantastic, thank God. And you know, strange, obscure 17th century maps that you can zoom in on as well, that are all online, which is a great help.
Okay, well, I think we should stop there and just say thank you so much. That was brilliant, and I can't wait to get my hands on a proper copy of The Honey and the Sting, because I've been reading it on my Kindle, and I want that really beautiful hardback. So
yes, they'll get them off the printing presses before it goes, you know, before it's meant to be released. But thank you so much, Joanna, and I'm so thrilled to be part of the Great Big Book Club, because it's such a fantastic endeavour. Yeah, thank you for having me.